So welcome to the webinar. Just wait a couple of minutes while the participants all join. Very welcome to join us this evening. You can see the participants rising nicely. Just as a very short introduction while we're waiting, I'm Walter Featherstone, chair of the Swindon local network, the IET local network. We'll start shortly, just when the number of participants has settled down. Numbers increasing very nicely. Just wait a couple more minutes. So welcome to the webinar. So welcome to the webinar. Just got a few more participants joining. I can see the numbers rising. So, yep, I'm Walter Featherstone, chair of the Swindon IET local network. Just wait a couple more minutes, and then I'll give a full introduction. Okay, it's reached 1:30. Number of participants is starting to settle down. I'm sure people will join. So yeah, hello, my name is Walter Featherstone. So I'm the chair of the Swindon IET local network. So usually we'd obviously hold face-to-face meetings. We typically hold those on a monthly basis, visits and presentations, but we're very happy to be able to host you all on this Zoom webinar. Just to highlight some of the events that we hope to host in the new year, we do plan still to be at RIAT, which is the Royal International Air Tattoo at Fairford Air Base. So that's one of our biggest sort of events where run over 3 days, and we're having many people at our stand in the techno zone. However, what's interesting to this evening is tonight's talk, which is energy and mobility, vault or fiction. And we're very lucky to have with us this evening Professor Allan Hutchinson. He's a professor at the School of Engineering, Computing and Mathematics at Oxford Brookes University. Just before I hand over to him though, a little bit of housekeeping. So we will be having Q&A after the presentation. So the presentation will be approximately 40-45 minutes. And I encourage you all to raise questions in the Q&A button, which you probably see at the bottom of the screen. There's the chat, which I encourage people to exchange ideas on, but really for the Q&A, I want to focus on the Q&A button itself. Please be respectful on the chat. And with that, I'm very happy to pass over to Professor Hutchinson, which will carry on the rest of the webinar. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over now.
Well, thank you, Walter, and good evening to everybody. I think in some ways these Zoom webinars are advantageous because many people can attend them rather than heading out on a dark night in December. So, energy and mobility, is it vault fiction? And obviously I've copied that from a film. And I think I ought to start with a bit of introduction as to where I work, which is the School of Engineering, Computing and Mathematics, as Walter just said. And in our Department of Engineering, we offer degrees in mechanical, automotive and motorsport engineering. We've been very successful for about 20 years now. I used the slide with an illustration of 2018 simply because I had it available, but we did well also in 2019. And the point of it really is the text at the bottom, the technical complexity of these little Formula Student cars, and the fact that to get a car to a race that's reliable, that works, that competes, requires a lot of detailed planning and a lot of managerial and overcoming logistical challenges. And the students don't get any time extensions. So it's a real lesson in getting something done on time. But the point about motorsport in general, and these are just small single-seat sports cars, but the point about motorsport is that it has to be efficient. And that efficiency can be translated in two ways, one into performance for motorsport, the other into economy for more mainstream vehicles. So if you can understand requirements for being efficient, then you can actually go a very long way in terms of sustainability, because you have something that's efficient. And because the talk is about mobility, I wanted to just start with a question. I'd like you to please put your estimates in the chat, and just say how far you travelled using all forms of transport in 2019. So just put 2019 equals X miles. And then secondly, how far do you think you've travelled in your lifetime using all forms of transport? And so just write in lifetime equals a different number. It's just interesting to see what distances people cover. So this is not just road transport, it's everything that you can sort of think of. And there's plenty of time to do that. Don't need to do it all in the next sort of few seconds. So personal mobility means different things to different people, I guess. In the old days, people walked around, and if you had some money, you could pay some people to carry you around. But that tended to be reserved for royalty, I guess, and anyone with lots of money. The horse came along, and we went from walking to horses as the primary means of mobility, and that worked incredibly well, probably up to about the year 1900. And the horses could also pull a carriage. You didn't have to sit on the horse itself. But then we had a problem, because the horse had an emissions problem. And in the same way we tend to talk about emissions from land transport now, the horse had a very obvious emissions problem, and people were very worried about the collection of horse dung from the streets, and it was just becoming almost impossible. Now, we therefore needed to have some disruption, some changes to the status quo. And is this chap, the Prime Minister, a pioneer of personal mobility? I'll let you make up your own mind about that. But this was a stunt that he was involved with many years ago. But the point is that some sort of disruptive change to mobility is almost inevitable in developed societies. We tend to think of mobility as something which is a right. We want mobility in a civilized society to transport goods, to access healthcare and education, to mobilize emergency services and so on. The question is, how do you do it? So New York, Fifth Avenue, not far actually from where Trump Tower is, it turns out. Easter morning 1900, these are all horse-drawn carriages, one car. And look at the crowds of people just walking down the pavement. 13 years later, same crowds of people again. And now there is just one horse there. Everything else is motorized. Could be basically the internal combustion engine, but some of these vehicles could actually be battery. And it wasn't just New York, of course. If we looked at a similar picture for London, the Strand, very crowded streets. You know, this take away the mode of transport, and this could have been much more recent. So horse-drawn buses in 1900, now they're motorized in 1914. So disruptive change is not new. And maybe we've got disruptive change again with the pandemic, because certainly bus travel has reduced by 50%. And people are looking for different ways of getting around, which also allow for social distancing. And alternatives to the bus, of course, would be cars. But if cars are not really an option, then people may be thinking of two wheels, motorcycles, mopeds, and so on, other than walking. So it sort of begs the question, really, has the pandemic actually catalyzed a bit of a change for the future? And what are the solutions to light urban transport in the future? And we've suddenly become used to this convenience of online delivery of goods to our doorstep. What does this mean for, what does this mean for the transport of stuff, as well as for transport of people? And I think it's an interesting thing. Now, the way that we've got around so far, of course, is to have vehicles, and we made them kind of nicer and nicer, more and more comfortable. But this has been using a lot of energy. So if we were to look at this graph here, the blue line is global population increase, and you'll see that really from perhaps 1930, there's been this astonishing rise in global population, perhaps threefold in my lifetime, if my lifetime started around about here somewhere. By the way, I'm not that old and I'm not responsible, but there has been this population which has been accompanied by energy consumption. Now notice that this is the total global population. The dotted line down here is the population of the industrialized countries, sort of fairly static, very gradual increase. So this is more in developing countries, but they are aspirational, using energy, wanting transport. And the orange line is the global energy consumption in some weird units, quadrillion BTUs per year, British thermal units. But of this world energy consumption, about 25% goes into transport. And that's why governments globally have been targeting the transport sector to basically ask the question, okay, what can be done about this in terms of trying to reduce the total amount? Now, we know that we've achieved this mostly by burning fossil fuel. We've been burning the dinosaurs now for years. The fossil fuels take millions of years to create, and we burn them in seconds, whether it's in power station energy or whether it's in our transport applications. And this has got consequences, which are, of course, the emissions. So the kind of message that we're beginning to hear more and more is that emissions are beginning to be a big problem for air quality, maybe not just global warming, but literally beginning to kill us slowly with particulates. And there's been a number of people writing about this over many years. I think Jeremy Leggett is one of the many people who have chronicled all of this, got some interesting books, and he's done a lot for developing countries in terms of developing things like solar powered lamps and so on, and sort of people using kerosene and actually not doing their health any good inside small dwellings where people may live and have to use kerosene for both lighting and cooking. So solar cleans up that sort of thing. Other interesting stuff has been going on. We started with perhaps Greta Thunberg, who kind of said, I don't know what the answer is, but you adults must be responsible. You know more than me. Why don't you do something about it? Of course, she wasn't quite accurate in that simplistic overview, but it did get people to think about it. And we had our own school kids coming out onto the streets. I think my favourite placard here is "Don't be a fossil fool." So it's garnered a lot of attention. And we know that some challenges are absolutely huge because global population drives human activity. And of course, with that comes the use of resources, all sorts of resources. In some countries, population increases have been astonishing. In Delhi, for example, over a 20-year period, population virtually doubled. That people take to the streets largely in two-wheel vehicles. There are, of course, lots of buses, but 80 or 90% of the vehicles are all two-wheeled moped-type vehicles with a fossil fuel engine. And this is just using up colossal amounts of energy, creating a lot of emissions. But our developed society uses energy to do absolutely everything. Energy literally makes the world go round. There was a song about money makes the world go round, but really you've got to, use money to do anything, and that tends to mean buying stuff, and that takes energy to make it, and then you use energy and using it. It's really energy that's responsible for everything. One of the many interesting graphs that's around on global primary energy consumption, 1800 to the present day, basically. Where has all this energy come from? Well, here was our traditional biofuels like burning timber, coal, oil, gas, a little bit of nuclear up here, and then we've got some renewables. So we've basically done all of this and developed societies on the back of burning coal, oil, and gas. And the consequences have been measured in different places. There's a chap called Ralph Keeling, who's been monitoring things at the top of Mauna Loa and Big Island, Hawaii. Sounds like a nice job if you can get it, I guess. And he's been monitoring the atmospheric CO2 levels, and the trend is pretty clear. And if we didn't do anything about this, the number would go from 400 and something now to about 700 at the end of this century. So the reason for this is the seasonal changes, but basically, it's a pretty convincing line, and it's way beyond anything that has been discovered in ice cores going back thousands and thousands of thousands of years. So emissions cause problems. We see headlines put out there by the media. And when the media rather loosely says that polluted air is killing people, really they mean it's causing premature deaths through respiratory issues. And I guess with the COVID-19 pandemic, that has, that's really come front and center in the sense that it's a respiratory problem, and the COVID attacks the lungs. And if you've already got compromised lungs from smoking or just inhaling polluted air, then you're in more trouble. And I don't know how it was estimated, but one of the items on CNN News a few years ago was that breathing in the air in Delhi, and we just saw how the population doubled in a 20-year period, is equivalent to smoking 44 cigarettes a day. Don't ask me where they got the number 44 from. But it kind of makes the point that there are consequences. So we want mobility. We're burning energy elsewhere, of course, in power generation, but I'll come to that in a moment because it's wrapped up with transport. So demand for mobility. It's led to our prosperity and growth, the demand for transport. That's great. We now depend on it, but the consequences are down at quality of the air, which is kind of easier to associate with than climate change because we kind of can't see the CO2. What is the source of that energy? What is the primary energy source? Not the energy carrier. Electricity is a carrier, but what was the source? And thirdly, there, congestion. And if you fancy a trip outside Los Angeles, then that's part of the road system. It's a real issue, and just making wider roads and increasing capacity doesn't necessarily help in the long run. If all of these vehicles perhaps have got one, maybe two people in them, that's not a solution to mobility. Now, the measurements related to greenhouse gas emissions show that emissions just keep rising from land transport by about 6% per year. I know the graph finishes here at 2010 because I haven't got a newer picture that I was satisfied with. But the dark blue colour is the greenhouse gas emissions from land transport, in fact, road transport. Then this little bit here is rail transport because it says 1.6%. Aviation is the orange and the dark green down here. This is shipping. So it's land transport, road transport particularly, which is the issue that we need to deal with. And we've had lots of lovely, comfortable cars, and that's been helping us get around. That's been fantastic. But car manufacturers have been chasing reductions in tailpipe emissions, and it led one or two to do some gaming to work out how to try to defeat some of the emissions targets or come in with lower numbers. And probably most people will know that Volkswagen was tripped up with the diesel claims in America, where they just didn't believe it. It was too good to be true, and it became known as Dieselgate. But they were by no means the only manufacturer. They might have been pretty extreme in what they did, and Mitsubishi was almost as bad, but there were others who said, well, actually, we sort of fudged it a bit. If you read regulations for long enough, you work out how to get around them a little bit and get slightly better figures out of your apparent tailpipe emissions, but also led to an improved world light duty test cycle for vehicles, which actually was kind of helpful. So by shining a spotlight on this, it did actually help to accelerate the implementation of a more rigorous standard. But by and large, all this is doing is just trying to improve slightly on the status quo. We've still got overall problems with emissions, and this has really hastened what some people are now calling the end of the Ice Age. And only a few weeks ago, the government published a 10-point plan related to the green agenda, really, 2030 being the new deadline for phasing out of sales of new cars and vans with a standard internal combustion engine. That's not very far away. So the ice has dominated mobility since the late 19th century. So we've had 20, 30 years. But it's become so complicated to try to reduce tailpipe emissions that the strategy for many governments is to say, let's just go electric. But having said that, whether it's electric or hydrogen or something else, there is no such thing as a zero emissions vehicle. It just can't be. You've got to make the car, and it's got all sorts of energy hungry bits and pieces in it, and there are always going to be losses along the way. So you can't have a zero emissions vehicle. Initially, when people were listening to the story about electrification, saying, but surely this is just problem shifting. So diesel car and that cartoon electric car. And they said, what's the point if it's just plugged into a power station the emissions are going to be the same, surely. Well, not quite true. In fact, it's definitely not true, because this has been cleaned up enormously. The electricity grid has evolved to a very, very impressive extent in terms of going green, which we'll look at in a moment. So the rush towards electrification is interesting. I mean, we were involved with the Electric Mini project around Oxford. So I was working with BMW. They invited us to basically do the research in terms of the energy usage, and our psychologists looked at some of the driver experiences. And the results of the UK trials, in addition to the results from trials in other countries, led to informing development of BMW's i3. And in rather more recently, the new electric Mini, which looks remarkably like that one. Of course, this was just a re-engineered one. And to a certain extent, I guess this is also re-engineered, but in a better way. So this was a kind of interesting thing. We also did the i8, and there's lots of electric vehicles coming out. But it's not as if electric was that new. When we looked at the picture of New York earlier, and I said that some of the vehicles then could have been electric, the Detroit Electric Company is very old. And it's interesting to see what Thomas Edison said all those years ago. Electricity is the thing. There's no whirring and grinding gears with numerous levers to confuse, no dangerous and evil smelling gasoline, and no noise. The very things that we're interested in now. But the problem was, on a lead acid battery, they didn't go very far. And so the ICE won over, but that's an electric vehicle. Here's a little wire going into this timber hut, which perhaps was an electric charging station. So we're going back to the future, perhaps. Now, sometimes we need a bit of celebrity endorsement of electric vehicles, and many people may recall that when the happy royal couple here got married in May 2018, they'd been given rather a nice wedding present, or at least it was in the royal household, this electrified E-Type, and the number plate was E, 19th of May 2018. And this sort of is kind of quite attention grabbing, because people like the look of E-Types, but are they that bothered about being a huge internal combustion engineer? They just like the look of it. A moot point. So, having talked about a few electric vehicles, there's a poll here, and I don't know whether this is something that Walter can mobilize. We just wanted to ask you whether you've ever owned or driven an electric car. And that's the first question. So we would like you to respond to that, first of all. So the first one is
So I think we've got a pretty stable answer. I don't know if you can see that.
And what's the second question then? Is there a second question?
I can end the poll. Can you see the results?
I cannot. No, I don't have that facility.
So first poll: have you ever driven or owned an electric car? 28% say yes, and 72% say no.
Okay, that's good. Lovely.
And the second poll. Is now in progress.
Okay, so yeah, those are the questions really. Who's driven or owned a proper hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, so-called PHEV? And the first question was who had driven a fully battery electric. It could have been a range extended electric. I can, every now and then some answers come up. Okay. So 26% say yes, 74%. So very similar. I wonder whether people are answering the same sort of question. I'm not sure the first question was as clear as it should have been. It was intended to be a fully electric battery electric vehicle car with no other powertrain involved. But anyway, that's interesting to know. So certainly a quarter have driven either hybrid or fully electric. So that's great. Okay. So I want to just turn now to personal mobility and weight. Perhaps it's quite apt at this time of year to talk about weight and trying not to put on too much weight. The red vertical line in this graph, these two graphs, is the 1 ton marker. So the horizontal scale is vehicle weight in kilograms, so 1,000 kilograms, 1,500, 2,000. You can see the average vehicle weight is about 1,500 kilos or 1.5 tons. And this more or less straight line for the top is a petrol car, and down here is a diesel car. And this, on the vertical scale, that's energy consumption, megajoules per kilometre. And on the right-hand side, some fuel economies in kilometres per litre or miles per US gallon. And by and large, we see that sort of pattern. And if we were to superimpose them, we'd simply see the line for the diesel engine vehicles a little bit below the one for the petrol. It's basically a straight line correlation for fossil fuel vehicles. And a similar story if we were to look at electric vehicles. So the heavier and larger the electric vehicle, the more energy it's going to use. And this is just the energy usage in the use phase. This is not counting building the vehicle. This is just the use phase energy, as indeed it was here. This is just what we might call tank to wheel energy consumption in terms of litres or whatever. So same story. Basically, what it tells us is that driving a large electric vehicle is not going to save the planet. And what these two pictures also tell us is that one person in a car is basically moving about 20 times their own body weight to get from A to B. Obviously, 4 people in the car is a rather better equation, but just one person in the car is basically moving a large mass of material. And it's the same story in the electric case. So we could say that's not a very efficient system because we're basically moving materials. Now, it'd be nice to think that many people would consider moving into much smaller, that's a light electric vehicle, e-scooters, or a pedelec. I've got one which actually looks a little bit like that. And they use, trivial amounts of energy. So getting onto 2 wheels for urban mobility is brilliant. And the beauty of the pedelec is that you don't even need to wear the lycra, although that's optional, of course. Some people like wearing lycra, I guess. It depends whether you think you look good in it. So that's where we are in terms of weight. Our problem with the electric vehicles at the moment is that to go a particular distance, we need approximately 20 times the equivalent mass of battery compared to the mass of petrol. So let's say a kilogram of petrol would take us a certain distance, we'd need 20 kilograms of battery to go exactly the same distance. So that is the current issue, having taken into account powertrain efficiency. And this is why there's such a global effort on improving batteries, improving energy density in batteries, and trying to reduce the mass of the overall package, making them more efficient and so on. So I did mention earlier that there's no such thing as a zero emissions vehicle. Of course, there's not. We're going to make it. This is a sort of a whole life consideration related to making and using a standard car, fossil fuel car. Well, we have to start with digging materials out of the ground, some natural resources. That takes energy. Materials extraction processes, that requires energy. We then stamp out or shape or form or cast bits and pieces. That takes energy. We've got the manufacturing, takes energy. The assembly takes energy. Eventually, we get to using it. And that takes 85% off the energy. And then at the end of life, we dispose of it. That takes energy. So at every stage associated with energy inputs, there is waste and there are emissions at every stage as well. And for a fossil fuel vehicle, we tend to talk about the sort of 85-15 ratio, 85% related to burning fuel, 15% to sort of making and getting rid of the vehicle. In a battery electric vehicle, it's very different. It could be 50-50, 60-40. It depends very much on the distance traveled. But if you don't go far in an electric vehicle, it's really not a particularly good story. So we really want to exploit electric vehicles. And that's an important point. Having a small electric vehicle, well, if it is genuinely small with a small battery pack, that's a good idea. It will certainly improve local air quality. But having a standard size vehicle and not going far in it because it's electric, because you think it's, I don't know, going to conk out in a car wash or something, it is just a silly thing to do. Because of this, the issue really for a conventional vehicle is that 85%, and it could be very trivial in terms of electric, but the trouble is that all this stuff in terms of making batteries and the powertrain could become very significant in a battery vehicle that's not being used. And it also means that we've got to consider battery disposal at end of life. What are we going to do? Are we designing vehicles correctly in the first place such that we can get at the battery packs, get the modules out of the battery packs, replace defective modules, extract the cells from those modules? Designing for recycling is crucial. Designing for circular economy for batteries is really, really important. And that's partly so that we can secure a future source of very valuable materials, manganese, cobalt, lithium, which is actually less valuable than the others, but even nickel getting into short supply. So we want to be able to keep reusing the materials and indeed use cathodes if they're still intact, use them. It's unlikely that every single cell in every module in a battery pack will be dud at the end of 10 years or whatever the lifetime will be. But unless we can get at it quickly and easily, then it's a problem. So that design thing needs to be overcome. But if we can do that, then there's no doubt at all that electrification is a really good solution. We basically have the infrastructure in place with our electricity grid. It will need to be upsized a little bit. But if we look at the generated electricity in terms of the grid mix and the composition, what we see is that it's been transformational just in the last 6 or 7 years. And we're already at a 50-50 mix of non-renewable and renewable energy. 50-50 mix. The UK is kind of ahead of target on this. for 2020. It's very, very encouraging. 2035, well, National Grid publishes different energy scenarios. Perhaps a fairly optimistic one is a 20% non-renewable, 80% renewable mix in 2035. I think that's pretty ambitious, but if that is the case, it's relying upon these sorts of figures here. 58% from wind, which means more than doubling the output at the moment. So these are averages for an entire year. Of course, it goes up and down, which is why we need an element of storage. But if we were to look at the same figures, if we say go back 6 or 7 years, then this might have been 65% or something, or even worse than that, and we would have been down here at 30, even 25%. So enormous improvement in a short space of time. And the result of this is that our electric vehicles, although they might use pretty much the same amount of energy as a conventional car, it's just physics, the emissions associated with the energy that they're using are totally different. Now, I had a project student a few years ago who decided to do his project looking at the Volkswagen Golf in its different guises, GTIs and the diesel version, and then the e-Golf, which has been around for some time, and he looked at what it means in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions equivalent per year related to plugging into the UK electricity grid. And in 2012, our emissions would have been here. And by 2017, they were halved. This is remarkable. And this is the difference that, okay, the ICE might get slightly better, but it's difficult to go far. We're down here. The answer really is that we are 3 or 4 times better already in today's terms, in terms of the whole life energy consumption of the electric versus conventional. And that's a tremendously good news story, but exactly whether it's 3 or 4 or some other number depends upon the scenarios, like distance traveled, size of vehicle, nature of journey to a certain extent. So if we come back to something that's quite fundamental to this, and I mentioned it at the beginning in terms of energy and power and transport. Up until recent years, let's say, we had our electricity grid, the power sector, and there was a certain amount of energy storage, which is mostly from hydroelectric. And we had the transport sector, which kind of did its own thing, and there wasn't really much interplay between the two. But the future means a integration has to be, and it's already started, because the transport is using electricity that's provided over here. This is getting greener. The grid size, this sort of bubble here, is deliberately a bit bigger than that one, maybe by 50%. I'm sort of guessing with that. And the amount of energy storage required has also increased, partly because the amount of renewables going into the system, because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, so we need more storage. And also partly because electric transport can provide some of that storage, what we're calling vehicle-to-grid storage. So vehicles plugged into the grid can release some energy into it at peak time, which is in the evening, and then they can take energy back again in the early hours of the morning when the grid has got its lowest demand. The problem is always the evening, sort of between, in fact right now really, between 6 and 10 in the evening is the peak time. So peak demand, especially in the winter, it's a big deal. Electric vehicles could potentially provide a solution to that. It would be nice if we didn't have to use the grid at all and we could power our electric transport directly, of course. To a certain extent, that's possible. There are some, giant solar canopies around. They lend themselves more to some countries than others, but we can have battery storage associated with these things. That's obviously got some potential. We've got lots of choices in terms of electric vehicles that we can buy. So there's no shortage of those now. All the big OEMs have come out with things. But why go for a conventional vehicle? Why not have something that's a bit different, a bit smaller, that uses a fraction of the energy? Thinking about that earlier graph. These are three-wheelers. That's the Toyota iRoad. That's actually a four-wheel pod. It's a Norwegian pedelec, but with a cover because they get bad weather in Norway. Believe it or not, these things are used quite a lot in ice and snow in the winter. And if some of you are old enough to remember Sir Clive Sinclair, his grandson is Grant Sinclair, and that's him sitting inside this thing, which is called the Isis. And judging by this, it kind of looks like it might be in the Cotswolds or near Oxford somewhere. So basically, this is an evolution of the C5. Again, using small amounts of energy, enclosed, a modern interpretation. And if we think small, then we also should be thinking of what is the future of mobility really? Where should we be? I think we could say that we could try to plan cities for more walking and cycling, more journeys by public transport, autonomous vehicles in the future, intelligent transport that knows where the traffic jams are and it avoids them. Probably the equivalent of a bus service, but in these autonomous things at the end of bus timetables. Sharing vehicles after we've all been vaccinated. Maybe people renting out their cars, kind of an Airbnb your car. And just imagine if we all had some sort of mobility pass, if we lived in urban areas, so that basically we, rather like paying a monthly fee for a mobile phone, we simply pay for any form of transport that we might desire on the particular day to go and walk down the road, get hold of a bike, a moped, a car, get on a train, get on a bus. We just have a mobility ticket, a sort of mobility Oyster card, if you will. But to make these changes requires sticks and carrots. Government policies and regulations really contribute to these sorts of things. This is all thinking about what's on the streets, and it really does need taxes and charges as the sort of sticks from government to make people do things differently. Introducing a toxic charge in London, for example, reducing the amount of parking available, one-way systems, making it a nuisance to bring a private vehicle anywhere into a town. Carrots can be, better transport, proper cycle paths, all that sort of stuff. I find it astonishing that in the Netherlands, apparently they spent 20 times more on cycling infrastructure than the UK since 1970. So cumulatively in 50 years, that's 1,000 times more on the cycling infrastructure. No wonder it is so good and so desirable. But we don't have to work at ground level. We could go up into the air. There's these rapid transport systems, so they take the congestion off the ground level, and there are a number of cities with this sort of thing. This is rather a tame version. For all I know, that could be Birmingham Airport from New Street Station. And then there's Elon Musk's idea of whisking people along in these tubes at very high speed in the Hyperloop, 800 miles an hour, San Francisco to Los Angeles in about 25 minutes. The idea to just build this alongside the existing roadway, because it's 10 times cheaper than putting in a high-speed train. At least those are the cost estimates so far. So some interesting stuff going on with that right now. So what is the future? What is the future? Well, I think Formula E, in its different incarnations, tells us that it's a showcase for technology demonstration, and with about 7 OEMs involved for next season, which I believe is scheduled to start in January, in Chile, maybe. This is far more relevant than Formula One to the mainstream. This is now where innovations hopefully will feed into mainstream electric vehicles. And the fact that so many OEMs involved with it tells you that. And going back to this, we're talking about a modal shift, changing a mode of transport, but modal shift means different things to different people. That's a kind of a modal shift, perhaps, or at least it is for the dog, but that's really not solving any problem. So I think with that, that's probably enough said, looking at the time. At the beginning, I was asking you the question, how far you've travelled. I think the question now is how are you going to do it, rather, without burning so much fossil fuel? Has the COVID-19 pandemic made you rethink your personal mobility requirements? And do you even need to own a car? Because certainly most of us in the last 8 or 9 months have barely used our vehicles. They've done a fraction of the normal distance, and I'm wondering why on earth we've got 2 vehicles and a drive outside. I've done a trivial distance in that time. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening. We need to really think about how we're going to, move in this transition from a sort of ownership to a usership kind of thing. Think about how to achieve all these distances that we're interested in doing. And this picture is deliberate, not just because it's an i3, but because it's got the government behind there, and government policy is always crucial to push a change. Market forces are not enough, celebrity endorsements not enough. It needs catalyzing by government to really force us all to change what we do. So there is quite an interesting YouTube video which people may have seen. And I'm not quite sure whether to go to that or whether Walter would like to come back and look at the Q&A questions, but I'm going to stop sharing at this point anyway.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you very much for tonight's presentation. I, for one, found it very insightful and thought-provoking. Yes, we do have a good selection of questions, I'm pleased to say. So clearly you've got people thinking. I don't know if you wanted me to try and provide a summary of the distance travelled.
Yes, that would be fascinating. Yes.
So perhaps we could start with that. So I was very interested myself, but I would say typically people were saying they were travelled about 20,000 miles in 2019, but there's a good range from the low thousands to the sort of tens of thousands.
Okay, yeah.
But 20 seemed to be about the median.
Mm-hmm.
Lifetime was a lot more consistent, I'd say, and typically, a lot of people down 1 million miles, up to sort of 2.5, and some a lot lower, sort of 400k, 500k. So, but again, remarkably consistent.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I might have expected. I thought about that myself, and I think in 2018, last time I thought about it seriously, I reckoned I'd done 30,000 miles on commuting, on business, on holidays, including flying a few places, which I reckon was about 1.5 million miles in a lifetime. I've got no idea how many barrels of oil I've used, but it's a lot, and that's just for me. So if you then multiply that by a global population, even if it was only in the so-called developed countries, that is a vast distance that we've been used to traveling, and that's just personal mobility. That's, not accounting for the goods and services, things which we've accessed and have come to our doors. So when you think about that, it's not so surprising that the transport sector accounts for such a large amount of energy used, and therefore is responsible for such colossal amounts of emissions generated. But yeah, that's an interesting survey. So thank you very much for that. That's great.
Yeah, thank you everyone for participating. So perhaps if I try and go through some of the questions, I'm not sure we'll have time to go through all of them, but we'll do our best. So kicking off, what's your assessment as to how the energy density of batteries for transport application will progress over the next 30 years?
30 years. Oh, crikey. Well, the government, I mean, I'm not a chemist. The battery sector is hoping for let's say the next 15 years, a 3 to 4-fold increase in power density and in energy density. Okay, between, let's say, 2020 and 2035, 3 to 4-fold energy and power density increase, and hoping for maybe a 50% increase in first life. In fact, the first electric vehicles are, barely coming to the end of their first lives now anyway, but I know some have. So that's still very much an unknown. So that was the first thing. 30 years out to 2050, I've got no idea, because I suspect that battery chemistries and everything else would be totally different by then.
I quite like this one in that we've had a question on the attendees highlighted they share your vision, but your presentation reinforces the reasons as to why. But politicians fear telling the public what they need to do. So how do we facilitate the change?
What modal shift?
Indeed.
Well, we just need lots and lots of examples. It's going to be driven by cities and city mayors, I'd say, where the changes will happen. I mean, there are many people now who live in London, quite well-off people who don't own a vehicle because it's just a nuisance, because they can't park it anywhere near where they live and all that. If they've got a lot of money, yes, they can probably park it right outside, but many people in London have real problems in trying to park anywhere, and they just decide not to. So a populous city kind of is easier to see how that all works, because public transport is a great default, and there are all sorts of car clubs and other things that people can access. I mean, even in Oxford, there are several different car clubs, and there are many people who just can't stand the idea of owning a vehicle in Oxford because of congestion and parking difficulties anyway. Modal shift, well, interestingly, I think the pandemic has kind of caused people to think a little bit more about how to get around. The sales of bicycles have been absolutely exponential. I mean, I can tell you that my local bicycle shop in Wallingford has basically sold out their entire stock of orders for next year, and they'd sold out they committed to getting rid of them all by about October this year. They cannot keep up in that bicycle industry. So that's the standard bicycle industry generally, but also they sell a number of electric bikes as well. So clearly there's a number of people who have decided that they wanted to shift onto 2 wheels, whether it's slightly assisted or not. And we're working with the Motorcycle Industry Association, who are very keen to find a new outlet for their, dare I say, slightly aging membership, who like to buy an enormous engined bike in sort of their middle years, but actually perhaps, when those people decide that it's not the thing anymore, the MCIA will struggle for members. But if they've been fronting a move towards light vehicles, powered light vehicles, then that will be good for them. And I think when people start to see these things more, whether they're different forms of electric, and they get in them as a passenger or as a driver or an owner, they'll begin to see more and more advantages. You already see electric and hybrid buses, and may well think that they're kind of nice and smooth. So yes, it will take time. And if people don't do it, then I guess there'll be more sticks and carrots from government.
Question on whether or not batteries are really the way, or do we need to have advancements in super ultra capacitors that will enable truly fast charging?
Yeah, true. Fast charging is an interesting conundrum, I guess. I mean, I don't see electric heavy goods vehicles for a very long time as a mainstream thing. I think that's far more likely to be hydrogen. It's still some sort of electric powertrain by and large, unless you burn it direct. So I think for the heavy goods vehicle sector, batteries are not realistic for a very long time to come. So diesel's still going to be good for that, probably. Maybe with some fuel replacements to reduce emissions associated with it. Supercapacitors, ultracapacitors, yeah, there are some retrofitting things going on onto some buses at the moment, linked to a kind of KERS system, which is interesting as well. I think there's a lot of exciting innovations which are being trialed. The battery gives you more sort of range. The trouble with the capacitors is that the energy's gone quite quickly normally. Whereas a battery, at least it stays around for longer. So perhaps you need some sort of mixture of the two. I'm not sure, but that would just be adding cost and complexity, I'm guessing. I think we've got used to the idea of a world car, a world vehicle. Something that does anything, goes anywhere, anytime, and a tank will take you 500 miles. I mean, you cannot beat the energy density of fossil fuel. But why do people need to go 500 miles without stopping? You don't normally do that anyway. So many people have got overexcited about range anxiety, and I think if you can go 150, 200 miles, that's more than enough for most people, given that the average distance traveled is about 8 miles or something in the UK. So I think the range anxiety stuff is overhyped. The fast charging, well, it depends really whether if you're fortunate and you're perhaps an owner occupier of a house, you can plug into something when the car is parked in your driveway in a garage. It's great. If you haven't got direct access, then that's obviously a lot less good. And then you're looking at accessing public charging points and fast chargers. I agree. I could see a bit of chat somewhere about fast charging is necessary. True, but only when we've got the batteries right that can accept that without sort of killing them too early. And that's about battery design and battery management and cooling. And it's kind of quite difficult to dump a lot of energy into a battery and not cause thermal overload issues. So there's a bit of a design issue with that, but it seems that Tesla are happy so far. So there's a lot of stuff which is still evolving, but medium fast charging it is fine. There's an increasing number of workplace chargers and an increasing number of public charging points which are so-called fast, but there's still the issue that the car is parked there whilst it's charging. So it's not like a standard sort of fossil fuel service station where you're there for perhaps 5 minutes and you fill up and you go and pay for it. I mean, people want to be there for an hour or two, and that's a different proposition. So charging at home is wonderful, and we found on the mini trials that particularly the lady motorists found it brilliant because they never had to go to a smelly fuel station. Just charged it up at home, and the car was good to go in the morning. So there are some advantages if you don't ever want to go to a conventional service station again.
Indeed. There's an interesting question on the urban travel model.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge, well, stated there's a huge cost for urbanization. So bringing people to work, bringing food to them, and then the waste we transported and disposed of, and the resulting poorer air quality.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, can we afford urbanization in a CO2 light future or a carbon light future?
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure I've really got the question there. Can we afford it in terms of what, the infrastructure development?
Yes, I guess the sort of you're solving part of the problem by moving people closer together so they're having to travel less, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a cost of bringing people together in terms of what you have to transport to them rather than them moving
Yeah.
to work.
Well, the global picture is that more and more people are moving into urban environments. I mean, it's best part of 60% of the population of the world now are living in urban environments. And before COVID, all the trends were going up. So more and more people moving into urban environments, which was why people, engineering consultants and so on, were beginning to design cities which basically not excluded the car, but would make it pretty difficult to actually own a car, and just have lots of public transport infrastructure and underground structures which would transport goods below the surface that we just wouldn't see. So yes, there's an urban planning piece there, but things don't happen overnight. The conundrum is always for the old sort of ancient cities in developed countries where there isn't space for stuff. So it's easy to do something in Milton Keynes. It's not so easy to, and maybe to a lesser extent Swindon, but it's not so easy to do it in Oxford or York or somewhere. But I mean, even Cambridge is looking at privately funded micro railway system going north, south, and east, west, totally privately financed, using small diameter tunnels with just one stopping point in the middle, and the trains would kind of miss each other, so that when one stopped, the other one wasn't anywhere near it, and that way you minimized the amount of tunneling and so on. And some estimates were very, very doable over a sort of 30-year period. And I kind of quite like the idea of taking things off the surface, and either you put them underground, which is expensive, but if you make the tunnel small enough, it's much cheaper, or you put it up in the air, which is the idea about some of these sort of hyperloop systems and the personal rapid transport systems that you'll see in some cities now. It's much cheaper to do that where it's allowed in terms of planning and other things. If the elevated tracks are too close to buildings from a sort of privacy point of view.
That leads on nicely to a number of questions regarding safety. So I guess with respect to things like Hyperloop, it's on the potential impacts of the human body of traveling so fast. And then the other extreme is if we're encouraged to move to smaller vehicles, how safe are they really when we've still got HGVs on the road?
Yeah. So I see that the answer, perhaps sort of answer to the second one, is that I would see these very small vehicles in urban spaces where they're not mixing with large vehicles and conventional traffic. I can kind of see some zoned cities in the future, or zoned towns, where the very small vehicles are not having to interact. And this is one of the critical things with autonomy at the moment, not being very uncertain about autonomous vehicles mixing with conventionally driven vehicles. But one of the nice things about the sort of autonomous small vehicles is that they can simply have active safety systems, so you don't have to put crash structures into them, because the idea is that they detect each other and you don't have to have sort of heavy crash structures, which is one of the reasons why vehicle weight has gone up so much in the last 20 years. It's not just the fact the cars have got bigger and there's more luxury. It's also these crash structures which definitely save lives. But they've added a fair amount of weight and bulk. It's also, you've got the crashing zone as well to absorb. So yeah, a small vehicle is obviously not going to come off very well if it hits an HGV. In terms of Hyperloop, 800 miles an hour or whatever, who knows? Depends what it really feels like. If it's a bit like being in an aircraft going very quickly, and there's no possibility of stopping suddenly, then perhaps it's kind of all safe in some sort of tunnel and it's some sort of tube on its own. I'm assuming it's using submagnetic levitation. And the idea that from Elon Musk was that the tops of the tubes would be covered in solar panels, so it kind of powers itself over these long distances through generally pretty sunny terrain. But to a certain extent, it's futurescaping. They've got some test tracks at the moment to sort of trial the idea. But yeah, I don't think I'd want to be the first, but then I don't particularly want to be the first, nor can I afford it to be a space traveller either. There's a lot to go wrong.
Quite a few questions on hydrogen. So I guess, what are your views on hydrogen for vehicles? And then concerns over whether hydrogen production via fossil fuels is not necessarily green.
Yeah.
And then also relating to even using hydrogen for air transportation.
Yeah, I'm not sure about. Anyway, the hydrogen, most of it's coming through using fossil fuel in steam reforming or electrolysis. If that uses renewable energy, that's great. Nicola Sturgeon's idea for Scotland is to use excess wind energy for electrolysis to basically make and then store, to compress the hydrogen in a suitable form, and then to distribute it directly or indirectly, use it in transport, use it in various applications. Personally, I think hydrogen is best for, as I said earlier, the heavy goods vehicle sector, not for personal vehicles. I think it's taken 100 years or something to develop an infrastructure for petrol and diesel. Take a very long time to develop a hydrogen infrastructure to do the same sort of thing. And I think there are at the moment a lot of genuine safety issues. So I prefer for that to be thought of as restricted to a particular sector which is still responsible for a lot of emissions. So if we looked at all those emissions from road transport, I think we're looking at 65% from the car and 30 odd percent from heavy goods vehicles. So if that could be hydrogen, that would be a really good win. And you don't necessarily have to then compress the hydrogen to 700 bar to try to package it in a very small space. The trouble with the car is you need that sort of 700 bar kind of thing to package it into something not a lot bigger than the petrol or diesel tank, and then you're kind of sitting on a bomb. So I don't really like the thought of that too much.
I think you'll probably have a few of us sharing that view. Questions on whether there'll be sufficient charging infrastructure, I guess in the near term, or even in a longer term time frame, sort of 2030. Public charging in rural areas, for instance, charging facilities at home when we don't necessarily all have driveways.
Yeah, well, that's only time will tell. There will be an increasing number of obviously public charging points. There will have to be to get general buy-in from the public, and I guess a lot of those need to be such that it's fast charging. So if you wonder what I'm doing, the computer's timed me out weirdly. Anyway, so I think it's something that's going to come. There's some very interesting stuff on retrofitting lampposts and indeed replacing lampposts. In fact, there's a little trial in Oxford right now, which was involving BMW and one of the providers to put in some smart lampposts, which not only have got a nice sort of little LED type low energy lighting system, but it's got a probably trickle charging, but basically, it's got the sockets on it for plugging in a vehicle, and if you were driving a BMW, it would tell you where the nearest, not only where the nearest smart lamp post is, but whether in fact the space is available as well, i.e. whether there's something plugged in. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting innovations. We've also got wireless charging, there may be all sorts of induction pads all over the place. I just think there'll be a whole variety of solutions. It'll take time, but there's over 1 billion ICE vehicles on the roads of the world right now. There's probably only a few million electric vehicles. It's going to take a long, long time to get anything like to that sort of critical level that's going to make a real difference. And that's why we have to really step up to the plate on doing something about it. The developed countries have got to show the way, just because so much fossil fuel is going into road transport right now, and the emissions associated with that, they're just not acceptable.
Perhaps just a final question or two, conscious that time is marching on. Question on heavy goods vehicle transportation and its evolution. Seems as if e-transport vehicles are much further away than for personal mobility.
I'm not sure that, well, yes, okay, they are, because they're large. Basically they're heavy, and heavy vehicles use a lot of energy, and yet it is a sector that's really important. So the strategies so far have been about replacement fuels and doing something about the liquid fuels. Second thing is some packages related to retrofitting with some sort of hybrid power plant, and it could well be that some hybrid stuff is quite a good solution. And then the third thing is the development of some sort of appropriate hydrogen powertrain in there. And yeah, I think it is going to take quite a while for that to filter through into what we might regard as mainstream. And we can guess from all the sort of news pictures of lorries in Kent that perhaps we're going to need a lot of hydrogen filling stations down there. But as I mentioned, in Scotland, the ambition is that a lot of road transport, both heavy and light goods, are may well become quite hydrogen powered. If the targets for the wind energy generation are met, I think it's one of the things which would be in the pocket of the sort of going Scottish independent. Because if you can be independent in energy, if you've crossed over from oil to something else, then that's a pretty important slice of the economy.
Indeed, indeed. Right, we've got many unanswered questions, and I'm very grateful for all those that have raised the questions, which has created a very interesting discussion and some excellent insights from Professor Hutchinson, who I'd very much like to thank for giving up his time this evening to give us an excellent presentation, very well attended, so very pleased to see that. This is unsurprisingly our last event, or at least the Swindon Local Network's last event of this year. So I'd just like to thank you all for attending. Thank Professor Hutchinson once again for giving an excellent presentation, and close by just wishing everyone a very merry and safe Christmas, and we look forward to you joining us on webinars that we'll host in the new year, and hopefully face-to-face events in a not too distant future. So with that, thank you very much, everybody.
Can I just say before people go that I didn't have time to go through it, but I would recommend for anyone that's not seen it, just to Google Mercedes AA video. It's a kind of a spoof on electric vehicles. It's 2 minutes. It's a very worthwhile 2 minutes of everybody's time.
Excellent, excellent. And just to also highlight that the presentation this evening was recorded, and we will be aiming to put that up on our YouTube channel as soon as we're able, and also encourage people to please fill in the response questionnaire that will be sent out via email, hopefully within the next 24 hours or so. So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you and goodbye.